My name is biannually, and I run the public event series here on Thursday evenings. So if it's your first time here, obviously it's your first time here for many of you, but if it's your first time at a Thursday event, you're very welcome back to another Thursday. And you can see the coming program on our website and Twitter and Facebook, etc. But it's a great pleasure to have this event as the inaugural evening of the Thursday event series, where we will see a presentation of a project that brings the different architecture schools in Sweden together, in both in terms of people, but also in terms of architectural knowledge and architectural thinking. So, yeah, without further ado, welcome to the event series, and I'll give the floor to Dean Anders Johansson.
Do this way.
Hello. Yes, this is the first public event ever in this school, so it's a historical conditioning you're part of now. So we are very happy for this, and but we did test the space, I must say. We had a few lectures here. Students have been here about 2 weeks. Teachers have been here a bit longer. We sorted out most things, and I hope this will work. Yeah, as Björn said, this will continue. Not every Thursday. We will have a regular events series, and we hope we start to do that also together with our eminent student-driven bar, because we think that's a great combination. So please come back and stay tuned on Facebook for all event updates. Happy also to see so many people here. I think we are at least 100 people. I didn't count, but I'm guessing. So, often it's better to do something than to do nothing at all. And if that poses difficulties in terms of resources, there is a good set of strategies for that. Term, for example, low tech in architecture, or lo-fi in music, and we have also low-res as a response to this question. The low resolution also has another quite good capacity, namely that it allows you to see the big picture. It loses out all the detail, but what is there is some of the principle or something that you can discuss as the main point of something. And I'm sure you can explain this much better and much longer than what I'm doing now, and you may even say something totally different, which is nice. And I'm very happy now to be able to introduce first, through this magazine, Low-Res, the editorial board team, which is Helen Runting from our school. We have Fredrik Torisson from Umeå School of Architecture, and Erik Sigge, again from Lund, sorry. From Lund School of Architecture. And Erik Sigge, again from our School of Architecture. And I soon leave over the word to you. And also I'm very happy to introduce Roemer van Toorn, who is the professor of architectural theory, now from the School of Architecture in Umeå, and who will be the main speaker tonight. So without further ado, thanks for being here. Thank you also for ResArc, which is the Association for Education of PhD Student, which is a joint venture between all the 4 schools of architecture in Sweden, who's in the name this is made, and who has also supported this venture. So, please. take the floor.
Thank you. Okay, so the program for today's session goes a little bit like this. My name's Helen Runting. I'm a PhD student here at the school. I will present a kind of editorial agenda for the magazine, and then we'll invite our guest speaker, Roemer van Toorn, to present for a little bit of a longer talk. And then my co-editors, Fredrik and Erik, will present on each of the first and second issues. So I'll just jump straight into it, and then I'll introduce Roemer. The architecture of the 21st century operates under the hegemony of the slick, the accessible, the legible, the recombinable. Architecture as it is discussed, represented and thought has largely been relegated to the domain of slick images, painfully operative diagrams, seductive catchphrases, and a cult of the personality. High resolution and high visibility, the shining new buildings, whether actually built or not, of the current neoliberal economic moment promise the possibility of legibility, of readability, of direct communication in a world dulled by the effective fogs of an economic logic that is in fact entirely lacking these things. An economic logic that's been described by many as schizophrenic, as mad. As Joseph Vogel comments, the so-called crises of recent decades have led us to ask whether what is taking place in the arenas of international finance economy is the efficient interaction of market actors or a spectacle of the purest irrationality. In any case, it remains unclear whether the much-invoked spirit of capitalism operates reliably or simply insanely. And it's within this insanity, an ecological, social, economic and political insanity, that we wish to position and discuss architecture. It is these conditions which prompt us to propose that architecture needs a low-resolution critique. So Fredrik Jameson proposed that postmodernism was an attempt to take the temperature of an age. And I would ask if we, as architectural practitioners and theorists, were to engage in such a manoeuvre now, some 25, 30 years later, how would we register the temperature of the present moment? How do we experience the present moment of very, very late capitalism? Reflecting on this question, we pose that architectural labour is experienced as simultaneously choppy and smooth, cellularized and fractalized on one hand, and connected and smooth on the other. In 2015, the work that is architecture is spread unevenly across the waged work of the office and the unwaged spaces of everyday life. Morning commute emails, the work related after work, soft catting on weekends, the infamous cafe office, coffice, boffice, etc. The connection of which is facilitated by the technological infrastructures of the interface, phones and screens certainly, but also magazines and media. The discrete tasks of architectural labour are not only divided up, as in the production lines of the Fordist 20th century, a process which has famously been critiqued for concealing the product from view, but they've also become radically indiscernible. Now, the entire process of production has disappeared. It's becoming increasingly difficult to differentiate between consumption and production, between life and production, between even sleep and production. A productive spirit in its various guises called collaboration, entrepreneurship, or the social, reigns. And in the midst of all of our various discrete, choppy and fragmented projects, it is oddly difficult to know when we're working and, importantly, for whom we're working. So, as Franco Berardi writes, within semio-capitalism, cells of productive time can be mobilised in punctual, casual and fragmentary forms. The recombination of these fragments is automatically realised in the network. So work, just like its immediate products, is chopped up, packaged, sold, reused and sold again. And as in this quote, from the point of view of the valorisation of capital, flow is continuous. But from the point of view of the existence and time of cognitive workers, Productive activity has the character of recombinant fragmentation in cellular form. So in service of this compulsively productive biopolitical economy, or perhaps as just a reflection of its spirit, contemporary architectural discourse is equally I can never say this word, cellularized, delivering a smooth flow of equally choppy bits. The architectural press is full of juicy images, witty sound bites, academico-corporate best practice, and well-crafted architectural self-promotion. The smoothness of the mode of delivery of the format, in fact, works to conceal the discontinuities of the content. In the academic press, this plays out in rigid writing conventions, uncompromising grids, endless peer review, and exhausting bibliometrics, undertaken in order to win indexing status and to win continuity. In the popular and professional press, the flow of images is insatiable, and the number of faces, always in black and white, often white, always male, overflow into the streets of cities. Advertising copies, magazines copying advertising. We all begin to look like we belong on an ad for Apple. Everything is smooth. And again, to return to the work of Berardi, reducers of complexity such as money, information, stereotypes, or digital network interfaces have simplified the relation with the other. But when the other appears in
flesh and blood, we cannot tolerate its presence because it hurts our insensibility. The video electronic generation does not tolerate armpit or pubic hair. One needs perfect compatibility in order to interface corporeal surfaces in connection. Smooth generation. So as feminist architectural theorist Catherine Schoenfeld points out, joining disparate things together requires the various components to be compatible, to be tolerant. A harsh or rigorous form of construction cannot vary to allow the presence of other components. Just like a party, two people get into a conversation and it becomes clear that, come what may, each is going to maintain their opinions and the one person cannot be affected in any way by the other. If you're the host, this puts you under enormous strain. You have to accommodate both persons. You have to be almost infinitely flexible, capable of being pulled from one side and the other without snapping. And so the architectural discourse instills this necessary view of a slick, continuous, smooth, flexible, and stimulating whole, of formatting the chunks of that process as compatible, combinable, and tolerant with respect to each other. Architecture media plays the role of a very, very tolerant host. So, what's at issue here? What's the problem? We'd like to argue that fragmentation, in fact, leads to repetition that renders architecture's operations both invisible and ineffectively personal. Undertaking small, chopped-up tasks, a precarious workforce is not only forced into precarious labour politics, but also into routines of repetitive copying, of recombining and recycling the labour of others. Short on time, short on confidence, and short on the privileged room to experiment, architects flagrantly copy from magazines that copy from architects that copy from magazines. This is repetition in the sense of going through the motions. In being performed over and over again, such operations are also incorporated, and perhaps this is where the politics start, as habit or doxa. So, as Wendy Brown points out, the model neoliberal citizen is one who strategizes for her or himself amongst various social, political, and economic options, not one who strives with others to alter or organize these options. Or to refer to the cultural theorist Catherine Rattenberg writing in Israel in the context of cultural studies, revolution, in other words, is transformed from mass mobilization into an interiorized and individual activity, not steered towards the toppling of any political order or even about coming to awareness of a systematic male domination, but rather transmogrified into ambition and metamorphosized into the nurturing of each individual woman, in this case, desire to reach the top of the power pyramid. And here we see hashtags like smash the glass ceiling being shown in architectural contexts in Stockholm today. So what is there to do? We'd like to pose to you then that criticality has never been tolerant, and it certainly doesn't play off the register of compatibility or clear communication. In fact, in its ambiguity, it demands that both sides change, not just yourself. Both sides change, rather than playing the aim of an infinitely flexible host wherein neither have to. Further, the invisible, the unthought, needs to be illuminated in order that it can be perceived as part of an external system and not a failure of oneself. Finally, variation of the radical kind in the conditions of today's capitalism is a matter, perhaps then, we wager, of introducing radical modulations into the underlying tone, of operating on a level, if one is forced to repeat, that at least repeats in discordant terms, that perhaps doesn't entirely behave. So our position then is perhaps to argue that the only thing worth changing are the structures that produce the possibility of a self. Architecture being one of them. We're up for any kind of contribution in that discussion as long as it has that aim. And we prefer if the work is low resolution, and by that we mean that it has noise, that it includes unexplainable echoes, that it produces discordant clashes, distortion, and that ambiguity is present. These are not problems but aims. Sweden occupies an interesting moment right now. It's poised on the edge of systemic mutations of the darker kind. Architecture is complicit in the dismantling of the state, of the industry of architecture, of its professional institutions, and of its own media. Architecture is complicit in the production of a neoliberal architecture of habit, of repetitive error, of internalized politics, and of infinite flexibility, of the kind that means accepting the subjugating conditions of the present for ourselves and, super importantly, for others on behalf of others. We don't think that one magazine or even 20 could change that. A whole generation of criticality a whole generation of critically aware architects, however, who dare to perhaps introduce variations on all those repetitions in their work might. We therefore need more magazines, and here we give props to the other magazine from this school, Skalan. More projects, more architects, more architecture, and more copying we think is fine too. This has been done before, but we hope not exactly like this. Thank you. And now I would like, having got our agenda out of the way, to introduce our main speaker. It's my great pleasure to present for you Roemer van Toorn, and as Anders kindly already presented him, he's the Professor of Architectural Theory at Umeå School of Architecture, and he's also been very personally important for us in starting this magazine as the coordinator of the course Communications, which we took up in Umeå, and that was the place where we kind of conceived of this whole idea. Roemer has such a long bio, I don't know where to start, but I could perhaps sum up by just saying that he's been on the board and the editor of about 1 million magazines, including Architecture in the Netherlands from 2000 to 2005, he started Hunch 99 to 2009. He's also been a contributing editor, author, and advisor to the Dutch architecture magazines Arcis, which became Volume, and Footprints, and he's also worked on Domus and Arbitrare. Further, he's the author of The Invisible in Architecture, and he's currently working on his forthcoming book, The Society of the End. Thank you so much for joining us, Roemer.
Is it working? Yes, it's working. Well, in fact, it's really a pleasure for me not only to be at the KTH, at the new building, but also I feel very honored to be invited by the editors of this new magazine, and that I'm allowed to say a few words about this magazine, Low Res. And of course, it's also very interesting that a group of PhD researchers, as we saw from different schools, in fact, work together to make this magazine, to make this platform. Because what happens often with PhD researchers, that they stay enclosed in a kind of isolation within their office, and maybe they see a few colleagues within the school, but it doesn't reach further. And so what we have managed to do, or what Sweden has managed to do, is to create a platform where different researchers meet. And that also happened, as Helen already said, that this ResArc research school, where there are conferences and PhD seminars organized by the 4 schools, and also in fact the strong environment like architecture in the facts, rethinking the social, as well as architecture in the making, that there are different networks which allow that kind of critical and collective environment to work. And I think actually today that's quite unique that that exists between the different schools, even on the level of Europe today. So I think it's really exceptional that researchers or PhD students today, that they take up an initiative to make a professional magazine. We have seen several magazines, but I think it's quite a task to start a professional magazine. And in fact, not only compete, but also start to collaborate the debate with other magazines. And what's also very nice, I think they have not only written very interesting text and shown their research and the research in process, but they also start to think about the format. So about the format itself, but also how it sits within the larger context of other architecture magazines. And when Helen, Erik and Fredrik, and I remember still, came to the ResArc program meeting to present their idea of this magazine, or the beginning of it, I think we as committee had no doubt at the table. We immediately, instantly reacted very enthusiastically, because if researchers and students come up with a great idea, you just have to say yes and do it. And in fact, magazines and platform of debate and discussion is very important for a fruitful research environment, not only within, but also to reach out to practice, to schools, to students, to other professions, etc. So to spread and to talk about knowledge and making it, and the research in the making, is very essential for a platform of exchange, where knowledge can be shared and discussed and also disseminated among researchers. And also very important, I think it's very good it is in English, that it also goes outside Sweden, because there's a lot of knowledge being produced, critical knowledge also within Sweden, which really needs to be heard beyond the borders of Sweden. And also going beyond academia itself. There is another, and last but not least, an important thing is that these days, in this neoliberal system, it became much harder for many magazines, critical and independent magazines, to survive. And what we start to see is that only universities, schools, and institutions, and sometimes a private funding, makes it still possible that magazines who collect and invite writers, journalists, and researchers to talk about the profession, to establish a discourse where we talk about the profession. So that has a lot of very good magazines. In fact, maybe for younger generations don't know, but in the last 35 years, many good magazines, independent magazines, have disappeared. And that is because a lot of architecture magazines had to be based on purely profit, and that made it very difficult. So it's very important that universities and institutions such as the government, like ResArc, or public money is still there to support that kind of publications. And maybe you're familiar, and we'll talk a little bit longer about it, but for instance, a very important magazine in America, I think, is Log, and I will come back to that. There's Harvard Design Magazine from Harvard, there's AA Magazine, there's Strelka Press from Moscow, there's the Nordic Magazine and Volume, and for instance Footprint. And if you look to those magazines, they all are really funded by a kind of public institutions, or in the case of Log, the American magazine, the independence is guaranteed because they have a quite unique history in funding. So it's very important to support, as institutions, those magazines and to sustain that. And I'm very happy that, in fact, ResArc is able to do and to support a magazine, Low Res. And I think the whole program committee and the steering committee is very pleased with this first issue and the future ones to come. As Helen already said, it's not just a coincidence. I think for sure it's not a coincidence, but I think what we have been discussing and developing in the so-called communication ResArc course, how you can and need to be aware of how, in fact, a message is staged. So when you have a message to tell or did a research, it somehow needs to be staged, or there's always some kind of stage or infrastructure or platform. And that you as editorial team always have to think about the content, but also in what form you bring it. And it takes too long to go into the course. You see here just something of the website where we documented everything in this ResArc course. But there's one thing I like to take out, and that is, for instance, that when Samuel Beckett was reviewing Ulysses by James Joyce, he said, here form is content, content is form. So instead of talking just over content or just about form, there's always an interplay between content and form, and that produces all kind of value systems, if you like it or not. But you can also use those, you can use the way form and content are related, and always related in the benefit of your argument. And it's very essential to be aware of that. So I'm very pleased how the approach of the magazine, already with its title only, low res, but also its size, the choice of graphic design, the rough, informal paper, being black and white, sometimes color, but it looks like as if it comes out of the copy machine. The choice of the font, its size, sometimes it feels like a newspaper. And of course, the themes and its content. And the pictorial editing really show how important it is to be aware about how form and content mediate the meanings of the text, the meanings of the approach, etc., etc. So, what you can say about low res, that in a way it puts academic research in another light. While many texts in low res are rigorously researched, I think it's still of academic quality. And at the same time, it also are records of PhD research in process. So it are not always finished pieces, but you can also sense that it's still open for other thoughts. So you're also being invited in to think with the text, or even besides it to make critical remarks and think it further. So it's also a test bed, in fact, for the author to publish something and then to see what it is and to develop it further. So it has a certain speed which you less find in books. It can constantly change and it's still in process. And that's a little bit different than traditional academic research. But there's something else, and it's a nice coincidence. It's not only that it's a new building, but it's also this year that it's the 75th anniversary of Walter Benjamin's death, and that will be commemorated by many publications, like Verso is now starting a series with Radio Benjamin. And I believe that Walter Benjamin, the philosopher, as we see here in the library, that Benjamin practiced his own version of what you can call low theory, in that the production of knowledge was not contemplative and was disinterested in the existing language games of the disciplines. Knowledge, according to Benjamin, has to be communicated in an effective manner. The task of real effective presentation is just this: to liberate knowledge from the bounds of compartmentalized discipline and make it practical. Benjamin already spoke in the 20s about the fact that criticism must change, and that the model for this change is the advertisement, or simply anything, as he says, that creates a perceived contact with things. Like advertising, or in other words, the space of the street, this new approach, beyond critique, according to Benjamin, must touch and fascinate readers, because they're touched by it, blown away by it, or simply warned by the subject. People start to desire it. So in a more theoretical sense, Benjamin tells us that the new approach, like advertising, should affect the reader with projections of fragmented intensity, which circumvent any form of contemplation. This intensity is something like a burst of energy, which affects the very life of the subject. This low-res approach, as you could say, championed by Benjamin, we can also detect on many levels, both in its form and content, of the magazine Low Res. The magazine breaks away from a classical understanding of research, I think. Not only do the articles operate inter- and transdisciplinary, at times even speculate, but they also relate to actual and urgent concerns from both contemporary and historical perspective. Rigorous and scientific as many contributors are, the essays are also written from a political and public concern, as Helen already addressed, exposing and criticizing past and present, like in this first issue on the Highrise, and I think also in the next issue, and we'll hear that later also about the real estate conditions. So in that sense, I think the magazine, like other magazines now on the horizon and being there, in a way, somehow do what Stefan Barry also tried with Domus at the time, and for instance, Abitare, and I will just read him. Today it is important to design and install antennas in the place of the world that are symbolically impoverished by the geopolitics of cliches. Antennas that not only receive, but also transmit richer information on the social and cultural conditions of places in which they are installed. Interactive antennas, like low res, is the most effective means to counter a geopolitics that destroys, as Jürgen Habermas would say, any chance of communicative interaction. Now I'd like to build up a little bit some dimensions of how I started to read the title and the approach of the book. And I'd like to talk about 3 low-res dimensions, aspects of the magazine. So, low-res, we have to admit, is not the only magazine reworking the format of its medium. Several magazines have investigated today how research could be presented, addressed, and how it could find a larger audience among different disciplines, for instance, including making it possible to have different contributions with a much more regular interval than books. So I already mentioned most of them, but for instance, the magazine Log, and already in the name Log, it's a kind of diary, a logbook of the current debate, the current research happening in foremost American, but also European research, which is regularly published. And also it's just black and white, very simple text, so it likes to be a document. You can take it in the train, under your pillow. It's a very easy to read, informal booklet, which is almost like an archive. It doesn't want to state a manifest or a new idea how we should read reality. No, it's a kind of walking in an archive of many voices, very intelligent voices, and debates and certain themes. Very accessible for us architects. But also you see, for instance, Harvard Design Magazine recently really changed its approach, and we see a similar kind of other way of entering and dealing with content, away from a more straight-jacket traditional way of doing research and writing about architecture and how you present it. The same we see with Strelka, for instance, Strelka Press, that are mostly e-books, so they have decided to distribute the work for just $2 or £2 worldwide, lectures and so on. And again, the booklet form is like a pocket. It's very accessible. The font is very informal, easy to read, almost like a newspaper. So in a way, all these magazines try and developed new formats in order to survive. That's one, but also trying out to reach a larger audience than just within the walls of a certain peer-reviewed group or a certain academia, to really share and to create a platform, an available platform to think about the profession and develop new ideas and what the problems are. And that brings me to another issue, and that I think is the necessity, I believe, as an intellectual to be an amateur. And that is not something I invented, but that's a term I borrow from Edward Said in this book, The Representation of the Intellectual, where he speaks that when you want to operate as a public intellectual, you are, and you have to admit, you also operate as an amateur, and that's a quality. So, according to Edward Said, the intellectual is an individual with a specific public role in society that cannot be reduced simply to being a faceless professional, a competent member of a class just going about his business, being a specialist in one specific field of expertise. The central fact, says Said, is that the intellectual is an individual endowed with a faculty to representing, embodying, articulating a message, a view, an attitude, philosophy, or opinion to, as well as for, a public. So there comes the aspect of the audience. And this role has an edge to it and cannot be played without a sense of being someone whose place is to publicly raise embarrassing questions, to confront orthodoxy and dogma rather than producing them, like most magazines do, to be someone who cannot easily be co-opted by governments or corporations. That's why it's so important that magazines have an independent kind of financing system, and whose raison d'etre is to represent all those people and issues that are routinely forgotten or swept under the carpet. Traditional intellectuals of academia uphold eternal standards of truth and justice that are precisely not of today's world. As public intellectual, and here I very much agree with Said, you need to look further than only your academic expertise. Make links and connections with other fields and the public, with the consequence, responsibility, and necessity that you have to operate as amateur. Because the other fields you arrive in and maybe apply or think further, they are not part of your expertise. So you have to be willing to see the consequences and possibilities outside of your field. And that means that you are an amateur. So low-res, to my mind, while showing rigorous research, qualities and expertise, shows how such an amateur approach can be relevant and productive. So even the magazine has something amateuristic to it in its approach, but that's a quality. Another aspect is, and then you wonder, why do I show these guys on motorbikes? It reminds me also seeing again the magazine in the light, like this glossiness and easygoingness on one hand, and then it's a newspaper, but it's also a political document. It's about a change of academia. It's PhD researchers not yet finished can write and bring their arguments already, and there are thoughts in process, etc., etc. And maybe you know these guys, especially the one at the top, the Minister of Economics of Greece. And I think they use a strategy of low res. But even perhaps they play with this ambiguity of a motorbike is still, I think, very macho and male at the same time. But they don't come in the typical managerial jackets like most politicians come today. So Pablo and Janus, I show for a reason, and I will tell you. So, as we have seen, and we've seen it now also in England emerging in the new Labour Party, but I think the Spanish and the Greek movements are very interesting, that there is a new political movement arriving where academics, in fact, not managers, are starting political parties. And in Spain, we have the Podemos movement led by Pablo Iglesias here below, and we have the Greek government, and especially I think Yanis Varoufakis is very interesting. And what we see that they are doing, that there is a new political popular approach and a renewed social agenda that has come manifest. So not only do they understand, like Benjamin, that the old formats in politics no longer work when you want to address the public and make all of us critically aware of what is really happening and undertaking by the neoliberal European project, but they also understand that other genres, other strategies are needed to expose what is really happening and to start to think about alternatives. I think what the Greek, for instance, did is they made very much clear to a large audience, in fact, what the European Commission was doing. they didn't find a solution, but the real problems were very clear on the table for a large audience. So what you could say is that how to make your critical voice heard, you have to inform the public. You have to become popular, you could say, in Brechtian terms. So it's not about ratings, but it is that you have to become popular. So, and the interesting way is that that kind of populism they apply is a very much a low-res approach. And for instance, Iglesias, they decided not to say we are not going to the Spanish king and all this royal stuff. We go, but we don't dress up. We go in our normal low-res clothes. So we take part, we say what we really think, but we are there. So it's just an example. They also had, for instance, a big television program. They decided we have to be part of the television and start to talk with the public and to the public from the popular media. So Spain's far-right pundits had embraced TV, and Iglesias and Varoufakis believed it was time for the left to do something similar. They are academics, they are specific intellectuals with a lot of expertise, but as amateurs they enter the arena and question the status quo, use another, you could say, low-res language to break through the facade of politics and inform the public. As I just said, Podemos started an own TV show at national television. Janus, never overdressed, comes in informal clothes on his motor to work, etc., etc. And socialism, Laclau and Mouffe argued, should no longer focus on class warfare. Instead, socialists should seek to unite discontented groups, such as feminists, gay people, environmentalists, the unemployed, against a clearly defined enemy, usually the establishment. One way of doing this was through a charismatic leader who would fight the powerful on behalf of the underdogs. Laclau and Mouffe encouraged this new left to appeal to voters with simply emotionally engaging rhetoric. They argued that liberal elites decry such tactics as populism because they are scared of ordinary people becoming involved in politics. There's too much consensus and not enough dissent in left-wing politics, Chantal Mouffe recently said in The Guardian. The choice today is between right-wing or left-wing populism, Mouffe told Iglesias in a TV interview Friday in February. If Iglesias had long seen neoliberals as the enemy and social democrats as sellouts, he eventually came to view the traditional far left as well-meaning fools. They damned television as lowbrow and manipulative, refusing to see that people's politics were increasingly defined by the media. They consumed rather than by loyalty to parties. What low-res actually as magazine will bring in the future in the political arena, we have to see. And of course, it's too much to ask for a critical magazine in architecture. But I clearly see a new, what you could call, on many fronts, political low-res trend, where on the one hand there is rigorous academic knowledge about the world, about architecture in the field, while there are at the same time strategies to become popular, to share that knowledge with a large audience, to have an audience, and to together educate each other and trying slowly, hopefully, see the possibility of alternatives against the status quo we are in. And I'm really looking forward how this approach of low-res, not only its form, but also in its content, will develop. And knowing the students a little bit and the PhD research environment, I think we will be surprised, and we will, and also from other people who are invited to come, I think we will see a lot of interesting and important work to come. The only thing I like to say, and that's just a footnote, I hope also they will go and be there as an ebook, because like Strelka, the book is very important and is still very valid to have and to work with, but I think to spread the word and the research they have done, I think it's not too difficult to become an ebook. But that was a note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roemer. It is my task here to introduce you to the first issue of Low Res. You can look at it here in the lights, but it's much more dramatically lit there with the shadows on the wall. And I'll speak a little bit about the content and the contributions and how we've ordered them and how we thought. I'll start with a quote from J.G. Ballard. Later, as he sat on his balcony eating his dog, Dr. Robert Lang reflected on the unusual events that had taken place within this huge apartment building during the previous 3 months. Now that everything had returned to normal, he was surprised that there had been no obvious beginning, no point beyond which their lives had moved into a clearly more sinister dimension. With its 40 floors and 1,000 apartments, its supermarket and swimming pools, bank and junior school, all in effect abandoned in the sky, the high-rise offered more than enough opportunities for violence and confrontation. Those are the opening lines of James Graham Ballard's novel Highrise from 1975. And the Highrise is incidentally also the theme of the first issue of Low Res. The novel serves as a scaffolding throughout the issue. It is exposed in some texts and looms in the backgrounds in some others. And sometimes it is a sound box that's modulating content. The book deals with life in a newly constructed high-rise where social order breaks down and is reshaped in various instances as the prospect of total freedom from the world outside opens up for both horror and violence, but also any number of definitions of the good life. As a theme, it opens up any number of trajectories for exploration. It balances uncomfortably between the degenerated utopian and the dystopian. And in Ballard's view, the two are not exactly contradictory. And it balances between the notions of discipline and resistance. Ballard bestows the high-rise itself with a great deal of agency. In the novel, the building itself becomes protagonist and even appears as a narrator on occasion. One key aspect of Ballard is the ambivalence, or ambiguity, depending on how you look at it, which produces a complexity. It is neither black nor white. As a novel, it doesn't jump to conclusions, but rather opens up for seeing the high-rise as something else than one normally would. This is what makes the novel so pertinent as a starting point for an issue of a journal that investigates the high-rise as a phenomenon. In terms of architecture, the high-rise remains one of the more controversial topics inside and outside the discipline. High-rises tend to provoke highly polarized debates where nuance and analysis often give way to nostalgia, fear, or unbridled neoliberal positivism in various guises. The sheer potential materiality almost demands a strong reaction in one way or another. Fundamentally, high-rises are, along with most other work, also habitually categorized within the architectural discipline as built or unbuilt, success or failure. Another binary which also serves to curtail the complexity of the issue at hand. In some ways, high-rises are unlike other construction projects. They tend to affect more people, and the conflict in spheres of interest of more actors than most other architectural endeavors, hence the fierce debate. This makes the political aspects of the high-rise more precarious than most other constructions, and they are economically as well as technically more complex than most constructions. So all in all, high-rises are, for those reasons, both slower and more mediated than most architecture, which also means that they work with somewhat different logics. In spite of all this, the debate still boils down to the binary yes or no, to build or not to build, or, as sometimes is the case, to build a much smaller version. There is, however, so much else going on at the same time, and that's what this issue of low-res is about, the question, what else is going on? Else in this case means what is going on besides the discussion, or even what is playing off that discussion. Looking at the else is a way to look for nuances and ulterior motives, as well as a search for inconsistencies and contradictions. The search for what else is going on is a search for what is assumed, invisible, or neglected in a polarized debate. It is an attempt to open up for seeing the things that have been rendered invisible by strong opinions, extensive mediation, paradoxically enough, and habits of thought. The content of the first low-res is by all means disparate, diverging in multiple directions, which by no means cover any comprehensive field, but rather open doors to further lines of thought or flight. The texts are divided into 3 sub-themes that respond to some of the different assumptions about high-rise. And these are, as you might be able to see here, I'm reading them from reverse order here: occupations, transformations, and projects. And I'll go through them quickly. By its very efficiency, the high-rise took over the task of maintaining the social structure that supported them all. For the first time, it removed the need to repress every kind of antisocial behavior and left them free to explore any deviant or wayward impulses. It was precisely in these areas that the most important aspects of their lives would take place, secure within the shell of the high-rise, like passengers on board an automatically piloted airliner. They were free to behave in any way they wished, explore the darkest corners they could find. In many ways, the high-rise was a model of all that technology had done to make possible the expression of a truly free psychopathology, which is another Ballard quote here. Firstly, occupations addresses the effects of high-rises on subjects, where the high-rise can be considered both a disciplinary device and, as in the quote above, a means of liberation simultaneously, and on an urban level where existing social and physical networks become remodeled and reconfigured by architecture on the scale of the urban itself. Occupations is a way of reconsider what else the high-rise is capable of, and of coming to grips with the complexity of the scale and its implications on a variety of levels. And the second theme is transformations. Given that external reality is a fiction, the writer's role is almost superfluous. He does not need to invent fiction because it's already there, which is an interview with Ballard, from 1970. Transformation starts where the debate leaves off. The section deals with what happens after the pristine moment of completion, and more importantly, how the high-rise changes and becomes something else, how it comes to mean something else, and how the embodied acts of its inhabitants radically alter the narrative and raison d'etre of the high-rise. Time goes on, even after the architect has jotted down built or completed in his or her CV. And, as in the case of Ballard's high-rise, these transformations are utterly unpredictable and essentially don't stop. Transformation is, in that sense, a look at time and how time flows in spite of the assumption that something has a moment of completeness that extends into perpetuity. And the final section, projects. The section entitled Projects deals with the world of the professional architect or planner and investigates what else is happening in terms of the high-rise as a project. It deals with the project's objectives beyond the material structure. One example here is the transition from a two-dimensional stable representation into a three-dimensional unstable object that keeps transforming as one reads it from different angles, producing an ambiguity that opens up for critical reflection on behalf of the public. This is the logic behind this image, which adorns the invitation to this launch, and I thought I should quickly explain it. It's taken from Katja Hogenboom's article here. She's sitting over there, where Konstantin Brancusi's infamous Princess X produces an unstable assemblage where the onlooker oscillates between association and title. And Katja argues for similar potential in Kohlhaas's CCTV building in Beijing. The project is also challenged to the assumption that the project is synonymous with the built structure itself, or, to put it differently, that the goal of those involved in the project of a high-rise is materialization. Materialization may well be secondary, or it may even be essentially irrelevant to the project itself. The project defined as traces of architectural activity that exert sufficient gravity in order to act as a substitute for the material building. The project has an underanalyzed capacity to affect the built environment and bend economic flows simply by its potential presence. This is a fact that opens up for simulations of proposals to act upon the world without necessarily even materializing. And this was a short introduction to the first issue. Of course, we haven't done it ourselves. There have been plenty of other people involved. And we have here Katja Hågenboom Seppede, somewhere here. Janek, who all contributors to this first issue. Have I missed anyone? And there have also been other people within ResArc who'd been enormously influential on this, on the production and helping us out and helping us get started. And we should mention Hélène Frichot here. And thank you all very much.
So that's our first issue, a kind of a pilot issue, you could say, and we're working on the second issue, and that is themed a plunge into real estate. And like Highrise, the first issue, the next one is departing from a fictional piece of writing, and this time it's Italo Calvino's novella, A Plunge into Real Estate. And I will read a little bit from that. In the little towns of the terraced hillsides, the new buildings played piggyback with one another. While in their midst, the owners of the old houses added another story and craned their necks to see out. The town where Quinto lived had once been surrounded by shaded gardens and eucalyptus trees and magnolias, where retired English colonels and elderly spinsters leaned over the hedges and exchanged Tauschnitz editions and watering cans. Now the bulldozers were churning up the soil with its rotting leaves and its gravel from the garden paths. Picks were demolishing the two-story residencies. The axe was at the broad-leaved palm trees, which fell with a papery scrunch from the sky so soon to be filled by the desirable three-room, all-convenience sunny homes of tomorrow. And our brief for this theme is also the call for essays. Every inch of the Earth's land mass now seems subject to some form of financial speculation. The forces of real estate divide us according to our historical, current, and even our future means, our ability to borrow and our ability to repay. Conversely, our judgments when it comes to real estate, whether they are optimistic or pessimistic, pragmatic or nostalgic, projective or critical, are most often understood as personal sentiments, assessments performed on a case-by-case basis. They are seen as individual and biographical rather than ideological. In this way, real estate plays off and affects dreams and desires, bringing us into being as subjects capable of owning, borrowing, coveting, and profiting from real estate. Under a planning and development regime emphasizing private property ownership and its protective discourses, public debate on urban development has become centered around medially constructed, opinionated communities of both NIMBYs and YIMBYs. And the shadow of this Pachomkin village is of open democracy. Actual decisions on the allocations of spatial resources appear to become increasingly complex and opaque. At the same time, when the common good is figured by the total sum of individual satisfactions, our legal and bureaucratic systems seem unable to counter the great variety of vested interests they encounter. They are thus exposed to constant attack by factions demanding the cutting of red tape. The business of real estate is the prototypical capitalist undertaking, evidencing as it does continuous economic development and inevitably progression of society, and the unrelenting commodification of life. In the current moment of the late neoliberal capitalism, realtors are expanding their conventional domain of influence deeper and deeper into the building industry and into architectural design, orchestrating material and immaterial production of architecture in ways that align more and more with their marketing strategies. At the same time, the building project itself has become the ultimate turnaround venture in which entrepreneurs, the doers, the independents, the hopefuls, and the hardworking are incarnated as building contractors, business partners, or capitalists. Commercial opportunities are not to be missed. The skeptics, on the other hand, are the ones who are too slow, too passive, or simply too appalled to do anything. They are the figures slowly forced into becoming sellers or unwilling minor players in the game of property trade. The second issue of Low-Res takes its starting point in Italo Calvino's novella, A Plunge into Real Estate. First published in 1957, the story unfolds through the eyes of a young intellectual who returns home to his place of birth in the Italian Riviera. In the heady climate of the late 1950s, the protagonist's engagement from the place is quickly supplanted by an increasing frustration as he is confronted with the rapid exploitation of land. The transformations through real estate developments are not only physical, but also mental, encompassing the alteration of attitudes towards history, class, valorization, and success. In such a climate, even the most hard-boiled opponent of change could be lured into supporting the very mechanism of change via the lure of being part of a given economic moment. In the wake of the current debt crisis, and after a series of publications in our own field, I'm thinking, for instance, of recent issue of Volume titled The Art and Science of Real Estate, the AA publication Real Estate, Life Without Debt, and, for example, Reinhold Martin's book and exhibition project, Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream. This theme is extremely timely, but at the same time perhaps completely timeless. Calvino's novella, with the original Italian title La speculazione edilizia, which literally means the speculation of building, is also a document of the historical reality of building speculation, the forces of real estate, and capitalism's ability to command our way of life. The untimely character of the topic, and again its current actuality, is also seen in publications such as David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years, and more philosophically positions publications as Maurizio Lazzarato's two recent books, The Indebted Man and Governing by Debt. So we have quite a few essays lined up for this second issue, and we're very happy that our guest article, someone, a senior author or scholar, is the Italian philosopher and professor Elettra Stimilli, and she is writing a piece on economy and debt, and she's just about to give out her most recent book in Italian it's going to be translated into English and published by SUNY Press. Another contributor, also Italian, is Daria Ricci, recent graduate from the PhD program at Princeton University, with a thesis on literature and fiction in Italian architectural writing. Her essay in next issue of Low-Res is specifically on Calvino and architecture, and on Calvino's interest in the city and in urbanity. A third author that I would like to mention is Jack Self, who is one of the persons behind the collective Fulcrum, and who recently published Real Estate, Life Without Debt at Bedford Press. And he's writing about neoliberal political economy and architecture. So with these and a few dozen more people lined up, the second issue of Low-Res, we hope that these different voices together address interesting aspects of the architecture, theoretical, historical, and political significance of the material and immaterial forces of real estate. So I think we'll leave it with that, but on the screen here we would like to put some notes from our designer, Tristan Main, who we have worked a lot with on what Roemer talked about, the totality of content and form. So that's something you could contemplate on while...
So with that, we'd just like to invite you to have a glass of wine with us, celebrate the first issue. If you'd like to buy a copy, you can. You don't have to. And just, thank you so much for coming to this first event in association with this magazine. Cheers.